Chapter 1. The Joint Account in Atlanta. In Atlanta, Georgia in 2012, Emily and David appeared to everyone around them as the kind of couple others admired. Their lives seemed orderly, respectable, and filled with promise. Emily worked at the university library, surrounded by rows of books, the quiet turning of pages, and the routine she cherished. She found peace in the smell of old paper, in cataloging knowledge, in the stillness of the reading room. David, meanwhile, had built his career as an accountant at a local construction firm, a position that carried an aura of stability and responsibility. Together, they created the impression of a young pair steadily moving toward a secure future. The symbol of this future, and the foundation of their trust, was a joint savings account. Every month, they deposited part of their earnings, sometimes in small increments that barely made a difference to their daily lives, but meant everything for the larger picture. Emily treated this account as something sacred. To her, it represented commitment, sacrifice, and hope. She recorded every transfer in a notebook, adding comments about what each contribution meant. Sometimes it was a skipped coffee, sometimes a canceled shopping trip, sometimes the reward for a week of frugality. She believed that their shared discipline was shaping a stable life that neither of them could lose. The dreams she nurtured were simple but vivid. She imagined a modest house in the suburbs, with a wide porch and a small garden where magnolia trees could bloom every spring. She saw herself sitting in the evenings with a cup of tea while David read beside her, both surrounded by a life built not on extravagance, but on constancy. In her mind, every dollar saved was a brick in the foundation of that house. Every deposit a step closer to the stability she longed for. David played his role well. He nodded when she spoke about gardens, smiled when she described paint colors, and agreed when she talked about family traditions they might someday create. To everyone who saw them together, he appeared devoted, reliable, and aligned with her vision. But his inner world moved in a different direction. To him, the account was less about shared dreams and more about opportunity. It was a reservoir of resources that could, if needed, serve his own ambitions. Their routine reinforced the illusion of harmony. On Friday evenings, Emily would review the balance online, smiling as the numbers grew slowly but surely. She sometimes printed statements and placed them in a folder she labeled Our Future. It gave her a sense of control and reassurance, as if the figures on those pages could protect her from uncertainty. David rarely joined in this ritual, claiming exhaustion from long days at work. Emily excused his absence, convincing herself that his trust in her management of their finances was just another expression of confidence in their relationship. Friends and colleagues often remarked on how disciplined the couple was. While others spent on vacations or impulsive luxuries, Emily and David maintained modest habits. Emily wore the same classic coats for several seasons, never chasing trends. David drove an older car without complaint. To outsiders, their restraint was admirable, proof of a shared vision for the future. Emily basked in this perception, proud that they had found a balance others struggled to achieve. Yet beneath this image of unity lay subtle cracks. David's thoughts about money were not as sentimental as Emily's. Where she saw security, he saw liquidity. Where she imagined a home and a family, he weighed options and calculated escape routes. His training as an accountant gave him an instinct for control and manipulation of figures, and he began to see the account as something he could bend to his advantage when the time was right. Emily, however, had no reason to suspect duplicity. To her, the account was the purest bond they shared, more binding even than the rings on their fingers. She often told herself that marriages failed when partners hid financial truths from one another, and she felt a quiet pride in their transparency. She never considered that the very openness she treasured might become her greatest vulnerability. The city around them carried on its own rhythm. Atlanta in 2012 was a place of growth, with new construction projects reshaping the skyline and a sense of renewal in its neighborhoods. Emily saw their joint savings as a way to anchor themselves amid that change, a guarantee that they, too, would secure their place. She never imagined that the same environment that promised opportunity to many could also tempt David into choices that would fracture everything. Every dollar deposited seemed to her a small victory against uncertainty. Every financial statement read like a love letter confirming that they were united. The truth, however, was already diverging. She lived in the world of magnolias and simple dreams, while he quietly measured balances, not as symbols of their bond, but as tools waiting to be used. By the end of that year, the account had grown to a figure Emily regarded as impressive, though modest by other standards. She looked at it as proof that patience and trust would build the life she envisioned. David, however, looked at the same number and calculated what it could buy him if he chose to walk a different path. The joint account in Atlanta was never just a pool of money. For Emily, it was the beating heart of her hopes, the anchor of her trust. For David, it was a door that could open to freedom, a reservoir of stolen time and potential escape. And though the balance sat silently in the bank, accumulating month after month, it carried within it the seeds of betrayal that neither the bank statements nor the quiet evenings could conceal forever. Chapter 2. Cracks Beneath the Facade. The first warning signs slipped quietly into Emily's life, subtle enough at first that she almost dismissed them. David began returning home later than usual, always with the same explanation. He spoke of reports that needed finishing, audits that demanded extra attention, projects that kept him tethered to his desk. His tone was calm, his excuses rehearsed with the effortless ease of someone accustomed to being believed. Emily, who prided herself on trust, accepted these explanations, though not without a small tightening in her chest that lingered long after he went to bed. Soon after, she began noticing peculiar entries in their joint account. At first, it was a single charge from a restaurant downtown, the sort of place that catered to executives, where a dinner for two cost more than their weekly groceries. Emily reasoned that it must have been a business meal, but the pattern repeated, and each time the names of these establishments echoed with unfamiliarity. They were not the small cafes she and David occasionally visited, nor the modest diners he once said he preferred. These were places she had never stepped into, establishments that served as silent evidence of a life outside the one she shared with him. Another transaction caught her eye, a rental payment for an apartment in Midtown Atlanta. She stared at the statement for a long time, her mind racing. Perhaps it was a mistake, she thought. Perhaps the bank had misfiled a charge, or perhaps David had advanced money for a colleague. The explanations she invented were many, each one a desperate attempt to quiet the unease growing inside her. Still, the numbers did not lie. They appeared with cold precision, detached from her efforts to humanize them. Emily told herself that accountants often handled financial matters beyond their own. David's work sometimes required temporary arrangements or reimbursements, she reasoned. To question him directly seemed almost disloyal, as if suspicion itself was a betrayal of their marriage. So she swallowed her doubts, filing them away alongside the printed statements in her folder labeled Our Future. Yet the folder, once a source of pride, began to feel heavier each time she added to it. The atmosphere at home shifted subtly. Emily noticed the faint smell of cologne lingering on David's shirts, different from the one he usually wore. She caught the fleeting distraction in his eyes during dinner, the way he seemed to drift elsewhere, even while she spoke. His phone, once left casually on the counter, became a permanent fixture in his pocket. These changes were small, almost unremarkable to an outsider, but to Emily they formed a mosaic of unease. Her days at the library provided little escape. Surrounded by shelves of books and the hushed voices of students, she found her mind returning again and again to the transactions. Each time she checked the account, she felt a flicker of dread, waiting for the next unexplained expense to appear. The account, once a symbol of unity, had turned into a mirror, reflecting shadows she could not ignore. In public, however, she maintained the appearance of calm. At gatherings with friends or neighbors, she smiled and spoke warmly of David's long hours, presenting them as proof of his dedication. She laughed at jokes about overworked accountants, never revealing the tight knot in her stomach. To admit her doubts would have meant admitting that her perfect image of marriage was beginning to fracture, and she could not bring herself to do that. At night, when David claimed exhaustion and turned away from her in bed, Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her mind played endless loops of possibilities. Perhaps he was overworked. Perhaps he was hiding financial troubles to protect her. Perhaps the apartment was connected to his firm. But each rationalization felt thinner than the last, worn down by repetition. Beneath her reasoning, a colder truth pressed against her. Something was deeply wrong. Still, she carried herself with composure. She kept cooking his favorite meals, kept ironing his shirts, kept adding small notes of encouragement to his lunch bag as she always had. The rituals of their life continued, like the facade of a house whose walls had begun to crack beneath the paint. The more she tried to preserve normalcy, the more she felt the fragile weight of it all pressing down on her. Her suspicion became a silent companion. It walked beside her as she shelved books at the library, sat with her in the quiet moments of the evening, and whispered in her ear when she read their bank statements. It was not a loud, explosive suspicion, but a constant gnawing presence, eroding her peace of mind. To the world, Emily and David remained the disciplined couple, the picture of stability. But within the confines of their shared account and their shared home, the truth was shifting. Small cracks had formed in the life they had so carefully constructed, and though Emily tried to patch them with trust, the fractures deepened with every unexplained expense and every late night. The facade of their marriage still stood, outwardly unbroken, but behind it the structure had already begun to weaken. By the time Emily admitted to herself that doubt had taken root, it was no longer a fleeting thought. It was permanent, embedded in the rhythm of her days. Outwardly she looked unchanged, the same quiet librarian, the same devoted wife. Inwardly, though, she lived with the constant chill of uncertainty, a chill that grew colder with every unexplained line on their bank statement. The account that had once promised her a future now whispered that the present was already unraveling. Chapter 3. Discovery of the Truth. One evening, after weeks of fighting back the unease that gnawed at her, Emily finally gave in to the quiet fear that had been following her. The house was silent. David had gone to bed, claiming fatigue from another long day at the office, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the dimly lit kitchen. Emily sat at the table with her laptop open, her fingers trembling as she navigated to their online banking page. She had checked balances before, but always with the calm anticipation of watching their savings grow. This time, her pulse raced, and the weight of dread pressed against her chest. The numbers confirmed her worst suspicions. Withdrawals had been occurring with alarming regularity. At first glance, they looked like ordinary transactions, neat and unremarkable. But as she looked closer, patterns emerged. The sums were too precise, too methodical, as if someone had been siphoning money with careful intent. She clicked through the details, her eyes narrowing as she noticed that the funds were not being directed toward company accounts or professional obligations, but to a personal account she had never seen before. The discovery struck her like a physical blow. The account was not shared. It was not one they had opened together. It was separate, hidden, and in his name alone. Each transfer appeared like a crack in the wall of their marriage, widening with every passing week. For months, David had been dismantling what they had built, piece by piece, while she held on to dreams of magnolia trees and quiet evenings. Emily sat frozen in her chair, scrolling through the evidence of his betrayal. Her notebook, the one where she had carefully recorded every contribution and labeled it "Our Future," now felt like a cruel joke. For every dollar she had proudly saved, David had quietly undone her efforts, funneling their life into a place where she had no access and no voice. It was not just theft, it was erasure. It was the slow dismantling of her hope by the man she trusted most. Her thoughts raced, but her body remained still. There was no shouting, no frantic storming into the bedroom to confront him. Instead, she felt herself sink into a numb silence, a silence that wrapped around her more tightly than anger ever could. The realization carried with it a deep fracture, not just in finances, but in the very structure of their bond. He had not only betrayed her trust, he had shattered the foundation of what their marriage stood for. The hours that followed were a blur. Emily printed the statements, stacking the papers neatly as if organizing them could make the betrayal easier to comprehend. She read and reread the lines, tracing the amounts, the dates, the steady drain of their savings. The transactions told a story she had never been meant to read, a story of calculation, secrecy, and deceit. By the time dawn edged through the blinds, Emily had stopped crying. She had moved past the first sting of heartbreak into something colder. There was a strange clarity in her silence. Instead of confrontation, she chose observation. Instead of accusations, she chose preparation. She understood that David believed he was clever, that he thought his movements were invisible. But his arrogance had left trails, and she had followed them. In that quiet clarity, she made a decision. She would not give him the satisfaction of her despair. She would not shatter into pieces before his eyes or beg for explanations he had already chosen to deny her. Instead, she would hold her silence, using it as a shield. He would wake in the morning unaware that she had uncovered his secret, unaware that the account he believed untouchable was no longer hidden from her. The following day, Emily moved with deliberate calm. To David, her behavior seemed unchanged. She brewed coffee as always, folded laundry, and asked about his schedule. But beneath that exterior, something irreversible had shifted. She carried within her the weight of knowledge he did not suspect, and with that weight came power. When she returned from work, she sat again at the kitchen table, this time with her mother's old paperwork spread before her. The documents reminded her that the past held tools she could still wield. With quiet precision, she began arranging what she needed. If David could play games with accounts, so could she. If he thought he was draining their future unchecked, he would soon learn that the future had already been rerouted. For Emily, it was no longer a matter of money alone. It was survival, dignity, and control. The betrayal had hollowed something in her, but it had also awakened a resolve she never knew she possessed. David believed he was the only one writing their story, but that night Emily understood she held the pen as well. By the time she closed the folder and set it neatly on the table, her heart had steadied. The pain was still there, raw and undeniable, but it was tempered by a quiet determination. She had chosen silence not out of weakness, but as the first step in reclaiming what was hers. David would never know when or how, but his betrayal had already planted the seed of his undoing. Chapter 4. The Legal Maneuver. Emily had always remembered how carefully her mother handled paperwork. When her mother passed 3 years earlier, she had left behind a small portfolio of accounts, certificates, and documents that Emily stored away with reverence but rarely touched. Among them was an old bank account, originally opened in her mother's name. After her death, the account had remained active, though dormant, legally still part of her estate, but entrusted to Emily's oversight. At the time, Emily had thought little of it. It was just another detail in the endless tide of grief and responsibilities that follow a death. But now, standing in the shadow of David's betrayal, she realized it could become her shield. The evening after her discovery, she sat at the kitchen table again, the folder of papers spread before her. The documents bore her mother's handwriting, neat notes in the margins, reminders of balances and signatures that carried the faint scent of old ink. Emily touched the edges of the papers as if drawing strength from the memory of the woman who had always taught her to think carefully and never rush into decisions. She realized that this forgotten account could serve as the very trap David was unknowingly walking into. Her plan formed slowly, but with clarity. Instead of confronting him or closing the joint account outright, she would redirect the flow. With quiet precision, she initiated a process with the bank to have all deposits and transfers rerouted to the account still bearing her mother's name. Because she was the surviving beneficiary, she retained authority, though the account carried her mother's presence like a silent guardian. The bank employees treated it as a straightforward request, another routine adjustment in a system of endless transactions. To Emily, it was far more. It was the turning point where she seized control without alerting David to what had been set in motion. The process required patience. There were forms to sign, verifications to complete, and a paper trail she carefully maintained. She scheduled her visits to the bank during lunch breaks, ensuring David would remain unaware. Each meeting left her both anxious and exhilarated. The tellers smiled politely, handling her requests with the detached professionalism of people accustomed to financial adjustments, but Emily felt the magnitude of every signature. Each document she signed was another thread in the web she was weaving around David. When the rerouting was complete, Emily returned home with a strange calmness. She looked at David across the dinner table, watching him talk about his supposed long hours, and felt almost detached. He believed himself clever, certain that his secret withdrawals remained invisible. In truth, every transfer he initiated now vanished into a vault he could never access. What he thought of as theft became nothing more than fuel for the account she controlled. The irony gave her strength. David imagined himself dismantling their future, but in reality, he was unknowingly reinforcing it. Each act of greed only tightened the noose around his plans. He continued to live with the arrogance of secrecy, while Emily held the real secret close to her heart. Her silence became her weapon, sharper than accusations, stronger than confrontation. The days turned into weeks, and Emily maintained her composure. At work, she filed books and guided students as always. At home, she continued the rhythms of their shared life. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, she guarded a truth that transformed her. She became not just the betrayed wife, but the architect of a hidden strategy. The rerouted funds sat untouched, accumulating, shielded by the simple fact that David had never bothered to look closely at the legal foundations of their accounts. She began to notice changes in herself. Where once she had felt powerless, now she felt an almost serene control. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer defined her entirely. She was no longer the woman staring helplessly at a draining account. She was the keeper of a secret fortress, the watchful custodian of a truth that would someday collapse the facade David had built. At night, when he came home late smelling faintly of unfamiliar cologne, Emily no longer lay awake, consumed by despair. Instead, she let her thoughts settle on the safety of the account her mother had left behind. She pictured the funds gathering there, safe from his hands, like water filling a reservoir behind a dam. Each time he dipped into their savings, thinking he had weakened her, he had in fact strengthened her position. She spoke to no one about the maneuver. Not her colleagues, not her friends, not even the confidants she might once have turned to. This was a secret too delicate to share, too important to risk. The silence protected her, just as the account protected their savings. And in that silence, she found a kind of power she had never known before. David, oblivious, continued to play his role. He smiled when necessary, offered explanations when questioned, and lived under the illusion that he held all the control. Emily watched quietly, never revealing her knowledge, never betraying even a flicker of her hidden plan. She let him believe he was winning, let him dig himself deeper with every transfer. The legal maneuver was not just a safeguard of money. It became a safeguard of her dignity, a declaration that she would not be broken by betrayal. She had turned his theft into an illusion, his deception into a performance that would end with his own undoing. And as she moved through her days with quiet resolve, Emily carried within her the knowledge that she was no longer a victim. She was the keeper of the fortress, and every step David took brought him closer to realizing that the ground beneath him was already gone. Chapter 5. The Collapse of Illusions. By the spring of 2013, David had reached the point where he believed his game was nearly won. For months, he had watched the balance shrink according to his design, each withdrawal feeding his private fantasy of freedom. He envisioned himself leaving Atlanta behind, escaping the dull predictability of his marriage, and starting anew somewhere far away where no one knew his name. The account, in his mind, was his ladder out of a life he had come to resent. He carried himself with the quiet arrogance of a man certain that he had outmaneuvered everyone. On a bright morning, he made the decision to claim the final prize. He dressed more carefully than usual, choosing a pressed shirt and polished shoes as if this day demanded ceremony. The drive to the bank felt triumphant. Every mile reinforced the image of his independence. He rehearsed the details in his mind, preparing for the transfer, the new account he would open in secrecy, and the quiet disappearance that would follow. When he stepped inside the bank, the cool air conditioning met him with a rush, but it did nothing to chill the confidence radiating through him. He greeted the clerk with an easy smile, handed over the paperwork, and explained what he wanted. A complete withdrawal, the closing of the joint account, and the funds transferred directly into his possession. To him, it felt like the closing act of a performance he had orchestrated flawlessly. But then, something shifted. The clerk's polite expression faltered as her eyes scanned the screen. She asked for identification, and he offered it without hesitation, already impatient to move forward. She typed again, double-checked, and then looked at him with a neutrality that unsettled him. She excused herself to speak with a manager. Minutes stretched uncomfortably as David sat waiting. His confidence began to erode, though he fought to maintain his composure. The manager returned, holding a folder. He spoke in the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. The account, he explained, was not in David's legal ownership. The name on the account was not his, nor Emily's, but that of a deceased woman, Emily's mother. The bank's records were clear. The authority over the account rested entirely with the beneficiary designated in the estate, Emily. The words landed like ice water poured over him. For a moment, David could not process them. He had studied the balances, initiated the transfers, watched the money vanish into what he thought was his safety net. He had believed every move was invisible, every transaction a step closer to liberation. Now, the truth struck him with devastating force. Every effort had been meaningless. He had been feeding not his own escape, but an account that had never belonged to him. The manager continued speaking, but the sound blurred into a haze. David felt the ground shift beneath him. The meticulous plan he had built, the months of deception, the lies told over dinner tables and during late nights at the office, all of it crumbled in an instant. His empire of secrecy had been constructed on sand. He left the bank in silence, his steps heavy, his shoulders hunched. The sunlight outside seemed harsher than when he entered, glaring against his pale face. In the parking lot, he sat behind the wheel of his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. For the first time, the weight of his choices bore down on him with unbearable clarity. He had not outsmarted Emily. He had not secured freedom. He had trapped himself in the illusion of control, blind to the reality that she had quietly dismantled his scheme. Every image he had entertained, new cities, new identities, the thrill of starting over, now mocked him. They were phantoms, illusions that dissolved the moment the clerk uttered the truth. He realized that he was not the master of the story, but the fool at its center. His pride, his greed, and his certainty had carried him directly into ruin. The drive home was suffocating. He could not bring himself to turn on the radio, could not summon the courage to imagine what awaited him. The city that once represented his escape now felt like a prison. Every familiar street reminded him of the facade he had built, the lies he had told, and the wife who now held the key to everything. What had once felt like victory had turned into humiliation. The collapse of his illusions was not loud or dramatic, but quiet and suffocating, like the sudden extinguishing of light. His grand plan, the one he had nurtured in secret, had not simply failed. It had exposed him. The bank, the documents, and the truth of the account had reduced his ambitions to ashes. In that moment, David understood what he had refused to see all along. His betrayal had never been hidden. It had only been tolerated, quietly observed, and redirected. The account he thought of as his triumph had been nothing more than the stage upon which his failure played out. And now, with no money, no escape, and no control, he was left standing in the wreckage of his own making. Chapter 6. Retribution in Silence. David returned home as a shadow of the man who had left that morning. His steps dragged across the floor as if every stride carried the weight of his failure. The confidence that had once animated his gestures was gone, replaced by a lifeless slump in his shoulders. His face, pale and drained of its usual composure, revealed the truth before he uttered a word. He looked like a man stripped of purpose, carrying an invisible burden too heavy to conceal. Emily was waiting. She had not paced the house in anticipation, nor prepared a storm of accusations. Instead, she had moved with deliberate calmness, placing on the dining table a single stack of papers. The printouts told the story in numbers and dates, in transfers and withdrawals, in cold evidence that could not be denied. She had aligned them neatly, page after page, so that when David entered the room, the truth would already be waiting for him. The silence between them was immense. David's eyes fell upon the documents, and the meaning struck him instantly. Every secret transaction, every concealed attempt to drain their future, lay exposed in black and white. He did not need to read further to understand. She knew everything. She had always known. He looked at her then, hoping perhaps to see anger or tears, something to assure him that he still had the power to provoke emotion. But Emily's gaze did not waver. There was no rage, no pleading, no desperate attempt to demand an explanation. What met him was something colder, more final. It was indifference, the quiet disconnection of someone who had moved beyond the reach of his influence. For David, the realization was devastating. Money could be regained, schemes could be redrawn. But what he had lost in that moment was irretrievable. He had lost her trust, her respect, and the image of himself as the man in control. In her eyes, he no longer existed as partner or equal. He was simply another stranger, one who had shared her home, but forfeited any claim to her heart. Emily remained seated, her posture straight, her expression steady. She did not need to raise her voice to make him feel the depth of his defeat. Her silence was heavier than any accusation could have been. In that silence, David saw his own reflection, small and hollow, a man undone by greed and arrogance. The house itself seemed to echo the stillness. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than usual, marking the seconds of his unraveling. David stood by the doorway, his hands twitching with nervous energy. But there was nowhere for him to place them, nothing he could do to undo the truth. Each beat of silence pressed against him like a sentence. Emily's strength revealed itself not in fury, but in restraint. By refusing to dignify his betrayal with anger, she had denied him the satisfaction of power. He had expected confrontation, perhaps even chaos, but instead, he faced composure. She did not crumble, and she did not beg. She simply allowed him to confront the evidence of his own collapse. David lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. Shame coursed through him, deeper than the loss of money, deeper even than the destruction of his plan. It was the recognition that she had seen through him entirely, that she had anticipated his every move and defeated him without raising her voice. The silence stripped him of all defenses. Emily, in contrast, felt something shift within her. For months, she had lived under the weight of suspicion, then knowledge, then strategy. Now, with the truth laid bare, she no longer carried that burden. She felt light, almost detached, as if she had stepped outside the confines of their broken marriage. The savings were intact, secured in the account he could never touch. But the real victory was not financial. It was the reclamation of her power, the rediscovery of her own strength. The man before her had tried to take everything, but in the end, he had only destroyed himself. She no longer viewed him with the bitterness of a wronged wife. Instead, she regarded him with the cool detachment one reserves for a stranger. He had become irrelevant, a figure who no longer held a place in the future she envisioned for herself. David lingered in the silence, but there was nothing left to say. His world had crumbled not with shouting or confrontation, but with quiet certainty. He realized, too late, that the silence was his punishment. It carried the weight of every lie, every withdrawal, every false smile. He had dug his own grave, and Emily had merely stood by, letting him sink into it. When he finally turned away, shoulders bent and movements uncertain, Emily remained at the table. She did not watch him leave. She no longer needed to. The chapter of their life together had already closed the moment his eyes met the papers on the table. In that stillness, Emily understood the fullness of her victory. She had saved what mattered, not just the money, but her dignity, her peace, and her freedom. She had allowed him to unravel himself, and when he fell, she did not follow. The silence, which once haunted her, had become her ally. In it, she found the strength he had underestimated, the strength that now defined her. David had believed silence was weakness, but for Emily, silence had become retribution. And in that quiet, she rose free from the weight of his betrayal.